Good morning, and welcome back to the second session of this conference. I'm Bridget Rosewell. I'm Chair of Volterra Consulting and Chief Economic Advisor to the Greater London Authority, so I have a keen interest particularly in the UK and the domestic side of things, and indeed the fiscal side of it. So this session for me is going to be particularly interesting. Since we've started a bit late, I'll get cracking with no more ado and introduce our keynote speaker for this session, who is Geoff Dix. Geoff and I think, first met when he was at the London Business School, and I was then at the Confederation of British Industry and learning about this forecasting stuff. And we've been more or less doing it and paths crossing ever since. He's now the Chief Economist at Novus Capital Markets, but of course, as most interestingly, was on secondment from there to the Office for Budget Responsibility when it was first set up, and I'm sure that experience is going to be very relevant. I'm going to ask him to speak first. We'll have a question and answer session then, and then I'll introduce to you to our panel, who will then give a short presentation each before we get into a broader session. So I'll start by asking Geoff to come and speak.
Thank you, Bridget. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Is fiscal policy on the right track?
Are the slides on the right track?
I'm going to try and answer this question in two parts. First of all, do we now have the right institutional framework? And secondly, are the policy settings that the Chancellor has put in place about right? Before I do that, just a quick word about the OBR and fiscal councils generally, because we in the UK were very late in the day on setting up an independent monetary policy committee. It was a long time coming. Most other advanced economies had already given their central banks independence when Gordon Brown did so here in 1997. But we're in the vanguard on fiscal councils. There are some, of course. Sweden has one, Hungary has one, and the United States has the Congressional Budget Office. But ours is different in a number of ways, which I will touch on as we go along this morning. But we are ahead of many other G7 or Western economies in moving to an independent fiscal watchdog. I'm going to look at why we got to the position where we are in the vanguard, why we do have an independent OBR, what it does, how it does its forecasts, and then the key question, is it independent? When I move on to fiscal policy per se, I will ask or describe what George Osborne inherited from Alistair Darling, and then try and describe what he's trying to do and whether he will be able to do it. Go back to May of 1997. Gordon Brown not only set up an independent monetary policy committee at the Bank of England, but he came along armed with two fiscal rules. These were the golden rule, which says that over the economic cycle, the current budget must be in surplus, or to put it another way, that borrowing was okay for the public sector as long as it was for investment purposes. Neither of these rules could be 100% justified in economic terms. They made some sense, and this one was particularly, the motivation for the first rule was intergenerational fairness. It's all right to borrow to invest, because the next generation will get the benefits of that investment, but current spending, which current taxpayers get the benefits of, should be financed by the current generation of taxpayers. He also had a debt income stability rule, which was that total debt should not rise above 40% of GDP. That he seemed to justify in terms of overall budget prudence. The rules over the 10 years that Gordon Brown was Chancellor had a checkered history. Over the cycle is difficult because who defines the cycle? Well, answer, the Treasury did. And initially they said that the cycle began in the fiscal year 1999 to 2000, but then just as the rules seemed to be going off track, they changed the starting date of the cycle to 1997, which lo and behold brought in another year of budget surplus, which meant that the rules had not been infringed. We in the city and in the newspapers and everywhere else, of course, accused the Chancellor of moving the goalposts. So even before the fiscal crisis came along, there was a lot of skepticism about the Chancellor's rules, and of course neither of them proved in the least bit robust across the economic cycle. The OBR, and as Bridget said, I worked there from May till October last year. Certainly when I was there, we took over pretty well lock, stock and barrel the Treasury's forecasting methodology. In the time available, we started work on May the 14th, and we had to produce a pre-budget forecast and then a budget forecast by June the 22nd. We had no alternative but to buy in to the Treasury's forecasting methodology. In general terms, it's a growth cycle or growth accounting framework. There are 3 steps, essential steps, to working out what's going to happen to GDP, what's going to happen to the real economy. First of all, you come up with an estimate of Y star, trend growth. How fast can the economy grow when it's growing at its trend rate? And the relevant parameters here, productivity, of course, is the most important, but trends in employment hours and, of course, population and immigration will also be key determinants of growth over the medium term. You then work out the difference between GDP, where you are now, and trend, the output gap. How much spare capacity do we have, or are we operating above trend? These, of course, are relevant questions for the Monetary Policy Committee and relevant to the inflation outlook. And in forming a view of GDP, we're also forming a view of how the monetary policy might react to where we are in the economic cycle. And the last bit is, given that we are starting, we think, from a positive output gap, that is a certain amount of spare capacity in the economy, how quickly does the output gap close? How quickly does GDP move back onto its trend? I said our approach was that of the Treasury, but it's very similar to lots of other international organizations. It's consistent with what the Bank of England does. It's consistent with a NAIRU and unemployment labour market approach to forecasting as well. The problem is, as you can see, we have 2 non-observables and 1 judgment. So we don't know what Y star is, we don't know what the output gap is, and we're making a judgment about how quickly they will close. And for a savvy chancellor, one who knows his economics like Gordon Brown did, especially with Ed Bull standing behind him as his chief economic advisor, those are manipulable. We can't observe them, we're making a judgment. Your judgment, Chancellor, is better than mine, obviously, and Gordon Brown would typically at times interfere in this forecasting process to bend the rules slightly in his own favour. The significance of all this, of course, is that the smaller the output gap is, the less amount of spare capacity you have, the greater the structural component of the budget deficit. So pretty well the first thing we at the OBR did was to introduce what we thought was greater realism into this particular part of the forecasting process. The column marked HMT is the March budget. So Alistair Darling's final say as Chancellor, and then the OBR forecasts. The OBR has done 3 forecasts essentially, a pre-budget forecast, a budget forecast, and an update in November. But essentially they have taken all 3 of those, the same numbers in this estimation process. So where the Treasury thought that trend growth would be something like 2 3/4, the asterisk there says that for the fiscal side of their forecast, they made a more cautious assumption that trend growth would be 2 1/4%. So they built in what most people would have thought of as an optimistic approach to GDP, but then took some of that out in making a cautious approach on the fiscal side. We immediately downsized our estimates of trend growth and split the period into two. People like me, the baby boomers, are coming up to 65, and most men disappear from the labour force when they're 65. Economists, of course, never do. They go on and on forever. But the demographics are a key part of the gap that we introduced after the end of 2013. Productivity, though, is probably the most important. Underlying productivity growth in the UK economy for about the last million years has been 2% a year. I'm a round number person, and 2 is a very good round number for productivity. Gordon Brown's or Alistair Darling's Treasury put in a higher number for population growth. The hours in the employment items are not particularly controversial, but you can see they ended up with faster trend growth than we did, a bigger, therefore, output gap, a smaller, therefore, structural budget deficit, and less, therefore, for the Chancellor to do on fiscal policy to tackle or even to remove that budget deficit. You can see from the bottom line there that we actually lowered over the medium term the level of GDP by 3.5% relative to what we inherited from the Treasury. So compared with previous pre-crisis trends, the Treasury lowered GDP in the medium term by just over 5%, but we lowered it by nearly 9%. Illustrating that here, the bottom line is the March budget. So that was the output gap profile that the March budget had, so more spare capacity, and therefore the scope for the economy to grow more quickly over the medium term. Our two forecasts, or at least the forecast that I participated in, and the one that the OBR produced last November after I'd gone, took a more cautious view, as I've been implying, on the output gap. You can see the purple line includes the very strong numbers for GDP that came out in the middle of this year, but that was not expected in the OBR forecast to continue. The two paths are pretty similar over the medium term. The structural deficit, this is the part of the deficit that fiscal policy has to address. It's the bit that's not amenable to the economic cycle. And you can see here that when we looked at the structural deficit, because of our different forecasts for the output gap and trend growth, we came up with more pessimistic assumptions for the structural deficit than the Treasury had in March. The estimates for both the current budget and the public sector net borrowing, excuse the confusion over signs. The current budget is meant to be a surplus, so a minus sign means it's a deficit. Public sector net borrowing is exactly that, so the sign convention is that one is minus and the other is plus, but they are both deficit numbers, one including investment, the PSNB, and one not. So the estimates for the public finances in the financial year that's nearly over looked a little bit better when we came to do our estimates in June than they had in March. So we lowered the overall deficit from approx 11% of GDP to 10.5%, with an equivalent or slightly smaller reduction on the current budget. But then see what we did on the two lines, cyclically adjusted and contribution of the cycle. We upped the we lowered, rather, the contribution of the economic cycle because of our more pessimistic view on the output gap, which meant that the cyclically adjusted or structural budget deficit, that which the Chancellor was faced with tackling, was that much bigger. Not enormously bigger, but a more realistic number, we thought, at 8% of GDP. Another subject, this is straying away from is fiscal policy on the right track, but it's important to our understanding of the economy and the economic outlook. And that's the fact, or the view, the widespread view, that growth from here on needed to be a better balance than the growth that we saw in the early and mid-2000s. There is widespread recognition that too much of that growth came from consumption, both public and private, and too much of that growth was debt or credit financed, and has left, obviously, in the case of the public sector, a huge debt overhang. So we're all hoping and looking for growth over the next few years to come more from exports or net exports, exports minus imports, and also from business investment. So you'll see in the top chart that net trade, the difference between exports and imports, is forecast by the OBR in their most recent forecast in November to make a positive contribution to growth each and every year, pretty well each and every year from here on. And within domestic demand, investment, the green bar, takes a much larger proportion than it has in the past, and government consumption is negative pretty well every year throughout the forecast. The role of the OBR, I've divided this slide into two, what it does, and probably more important, what it doesn't do. So the OBR is charged with producing a forecast, or producing the official forecast, because the Chancellor has handed over the official forecast that he's obliged to make under the Industry Act twice a year to the Office for Budget Responsibility, and that of course includes a full forecast of the public finances. Over and above that, the OBR has to examine, scrutinise the costings that the Treasury makes at the time of the budget to ensure that they're not overstating the effects of any changes in the tax system, and then on the basis of all that, judge whether the Chancellor is going to meet his fiscal mandate, or at least meet his fiscal mandate with a greater than 50% probability. But what it doesn't do, and there was, I think, some confusion about this when it was set up, the OBR does not advise on policy. It doesn't get involved with the day-to-day policy-making business. It doesn't get involved with what goes in the budget. Of course, when things appear on what they call the budget scorecard, the OBR has to scrutinise them and cost them, but all of the fiscal decisions on taxes and spending, and indeed on the mandate, were the Chancellor's. I suppose you might think that the OBR itself would have had a view on the mandate about how quickly the budget deficit should or should not be reduced, but we were not asked our views on that. It was the Chancellor's decision on what he wanted to do over the medium term. We, the OBR, then and now, are only asked to comment on whether it's feasible. The OBR on the 24th of January put a briefing paper, its first and last so far briefing paper, on its website on how they do the public finances forecasting. Believe you me, it's a tortuous process. Between May the 14th and June the 22nd, in my time at the OBR before the budget, I went to more meetings than I've been to in the rest of my life put together. It was wall-to-wall meetings with the Treasury, with HMRC, the Revenue and Customs and Inland Revenue Department, with DWP, Work and Pensions, and so on. What the OBR does is send out to these departments a baseline forecast and then ask the revenue departments and the spending departments to a lesser extent, to come back with their forecast for revenues, etc. And this process goes round 3 or 4 times. It's a long process. The minutiae is impressive. They go into virtually every line of the public finances. Outsiders who say, why didn't they just hand it over to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, it just misses the point. The detail and the degree that they go into in order to try and get the best forecast that they possibly can for the public finance is, as I say, impressive. We ask the departments to run slightly different variants of their assumptions. We question their methodology, and we arrive at the end at the best forecasts we can. Having said all that, I'm rather skeptical about this process. The fiscal forecast will be accurate almost to the last pound, shilling, and pence, subject to an economic forecast which everybody knows will be wrong. I mean, economic forecasts in their very nature go wrong, and the ones we produced last summer went wrong very quickly because GDP was very much stronger over the summer than we expected. But given the GDP forecast, the public finance forecasts are scrutinized and gone over with a fine-tooth comb. The other thing that the OBR tried to do was to increase the general transparency of the system. What this means in large part is publishing an enormous amount of numbers. Those of you who are students of the Bank of England will know that it publishes 2 numbers, GDP and the CPI. The OBR has published so much more detail, all of the components of demand, consumption, investment, government spending on a quarterly basis. It's produced a quarterly profile for inflation with numbers, not just a fan chart and numerical parameters. All of the components of the public finances, the output gap numerated on a quarterly basis that has enabled me to draw my charts. There's a wealth of detail in an attempt to make the process that much more transparent. We also, for the first time in June, and I dare say Chris Giles might have something to say on this, we also produced estimates of the fiscal multipliers because the June budget was going to be putting up VAT, changing personal allowances, and it was important for us to work out the effects of these policy changes on the public finances. This is unprecedented. No one in the UK has ever come up, no official body has ever come up with its estimates for the fiscal multipliers before, and to the best of my knowledge, no other country does it either. Bodies like the OECD might, but for a public body, as I say, this has never happened before. The fiscal forecast, this table takes you through from the pre-budget forecast to the budget forecast. So you have the effects of the budget in the top line, all the changes, the VAT changes, the income tax changes, the welfare benefits changes, enumerated. And then you have a line, other changes. I'm probably running out of time, but I'm tempted to ask the students, who are probably all congregated at the back there, who are doing A-level economics, some of them, what do you think the other changes represent? Anyone at the back prepared to have a go at where these other changes come from? I'll give you a clue. They come from the bottom half of that table, the fiscal multipliers. So the Chancellor raises taxes, but of course that slows economic growth, and then he loses revenues through the multiplier process. Again, a remarkable transparency showing these estimates, which of course some might think would be a little bit of an embarrassment to the Chancellor, that he, in order to cut the budget deficit from 71 to 37, he's got to raise taxes by a lot more than that, because he'll lose some in the multiplier process. Drawing on to the other part of my agenda, about whether Osborne is on the right track and what he inherited from Darling. You can see from the top line here that Alistair Darling's ambition was to reduce the structural deficit to 2.5% of GDP. He was going to do that by a mix of tax increases. We're all, most of us, or at least those of us in work in this room, will be paying higher national insurance contributions with effect from the 1st or the 4th of April, whatever it is. And he was also going to cut public spending from 43% to under 40% of GDP. Osborne, of course, decided that that was not enough, that he needed to go further and faster, particularly from 2012-13 onwards. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding possibly about how much is coming in 2011-2012 and how much extra Osborne has thrown at the next fiscal year. Most of the differences between what Osborne wants to do and what Darling was intending to do come in the out years. He also, of course, wanted to get more of his cuts on the expenditure side and rather less on taxes. We've had the main tax-raising measure, the increase in VAT. It's the expenditure measures, the squeeze on departments, the cuts in welfare that are all coming. And he wanted to lower public spending by another 3 percentage points relative to GDP. So a more ambitious process. My final slide just asks the initial question that I was asked to confront: is fiscal policy on the right track? Like all economists, I'm not going to answer that question. That's much too difficult. I'm just going to illustrate some of the parameters and leave the wise men on the panel to answer it for me. First of all, I would say that most economists, most international bodies would endorse 3 prongs to the current approach. First of all, when I was at the OBR, we got a lot of support from people like the OECD saying this was exactly the right thing, trying to introduce some independence into fiscal policy. It should have been done years ago, and praising the UK for being relatively far advanced in this process. There's also, I think, and Ed Balls and others can obviously disagree with me here, but I think there was a general view amongst economists that Alistair Darling was not going far or fast enough, and that Osborne was right to be more ambitious about reducing the deficit. And of course, we've all recognized the case for rebalancing. When I was at the OBR, Standard & Poor's, one of the rating agencies, and why anyone takes any notice at all of the rating agencies after their hopeless performance in the financial crisis, I don't know, but some people do. But Standard & Poor's had put the UK on negative watch. The UK has had a AAA status from all the ratings agencies forever. We've never defaulted, we never will. Osborne, I think quite rightly, was a bit miffed that they were putting us on a negative watch. But we're off it now. And when I was at the OBR, we had to see all the rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Moody's and Fitch, to explain what we were doing and our interpretation of what the government was doing. The argument against further and faster, which you'll hear articulated from Ed Balls in particular, is that the fiscal measures threaten the recovery. Clearly, the Bank of England has no scope for easing monetary policy any further to compensate for fiscal tightening. Indeed, you've heard already this morning that they shouldn't be doing any more monetary easing, rather the reverse. But there is a worry that if you are tightening fiscal policy in a standard Keynesian multiplier national accounts framework, then you will, of course, derail the recovery and threaten a double dip. Well, it hasn't happened yet. The economy started very well in the first year of recovery. Growth was 2.7%, compared with 2% that we saw in the recoveries of the 80s and 90s. So we started off more rapidly, obviously from a much deeper trough. But then GDP fell unexpectedly in the fourth quarter. It was probably all in the December snows. I'm struck by data yesterday which showed that hours worked in the fourth quarter actually went up. So we all struggled through the snow, got to work longer hours and produce less. I guess we just got to work and talked about the weather while we were there. But these are all, of course, unanswered questions. I mean, I can say to you quite simply, fiscal policy should be tightened as far and as fast as the economy can stand. No one doubts that we've got to reduce the deficit. Very few people would say that Osborne's ultimate aim of balancing the current budget was the wrong one. It was, of course, Gordon Brown's fiscal rule. So it's a laudable aim. It's one that's worth striving for, but not at a speed if it derails the recovery. So that's why I'm not answering the question, is fiscal policy on the right track? We don't know. We know we've got no scope for monetary easing. Fiscal policy, in my book, has to be alert to the dangers. Indeed, monetary policy has to be alert to the dangers of a double dip, but the ambition is there. And of course, as the government has emphasized, there is no plan B. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geoff. Just to kick off, I was just thinking from what you said, one of the other questions about the scale of the cuts and so on is about the balance between tax and spending increases. Yeah. So you might agree about the deficit reduction, but still think that the balance was in the wrong place. And indeed, there's that combined with the kind of scare stories that keep coming out of the public sector and local government in particular suggest that all these spending cuts have already happened, whereas what you were saying is that those are due to come in the future. Would you like to comment on those propositions?
Well, Osborne, I don't know the research, but I believe there is a body of research done by the IMF and others that suggests that successful fiscal consolidations do obey approximately that 80-20 rule, that the more you can do on government spending, particularly government consumption as opposed to investment, the easier it is to effect the desired fiscal consolidation. And the more you do on taxes or government investment, then the worse or the more difficult it is, because you're hurting your investment infrastructure and you're hurting private sector spending, which you want to take over from government spending. So there is that body of research which Osborne was very keen to align himself with, which supports the approximate 80-20 split. The second part of your question is a good one, because what I read in the newspapers and all the anecdotal evidence that seems to be coming out of local authorities and others is that the squeeze on their spending is enormous. Whereas, as I suggested in my bit, the squeeze was meant to be gradual over a period of time. So I find it difficult to reconcile that profile with the noises that come out about how intense the squeeze is in year one. Okay.
Maybe that's something we can come back to as we widen this out. But in the first instance, are there any direct questions to Geoff at this point? Would anybody like to come in now? On the question of the transparency of the OBR, perhaps? No, evidently not. Well, I'd come to, there's another thing I think that is an important issue, that's one of these other sort of puzzles, if you like, in what I see as being a distinction between what you read in at least some newspapers, obviously not those represented here, and what you see in the actual numbers, which is the deficit is all down to the banks. Now, you started with your analysis of the OBR position and this different analysis between what was cyclical and what was structural. How far is that cyclical piece to do with bailing out banks? Because when I look for those numbers, I can't find them.
Well, I think there's a difference between the stock and the flow. The debt-income ratio has doubled, approx, is that right, from 40% to 80%, something like that. And an enormous amount of that is handing money over to the banks that they needed to be bailed out. But in terms of the flow, which is the increment to the stock, obviously, and the annual budget deficit, I think you can attribute rather less ongoing to the banks, except to the extent that they caused the recession. Then it's a large part of that is cyclical. But whether it's the banks or whatever it was, we are left with a structural budget deficit, one, therefore, that has to be tackled. And, I mean, I'm not in the blame game. I work for RBS, so I'll blame them more than anybody. But who caused the crisis and who's responsible for the deficit is one for the historians. I mean, we're going forward, we've got to tackle it. And we're tackling some of it by the bank levy, of course. We are raising, is it £3 billion a year from the banks? They have to play their part in getting the deficit down. But as to who, why, and blame, no, I don't go there.
Okay, fair enough. Are there anybody else want to come in? Yes, gentleman there.
My question is, how
Could you
realistic...
just say who you are, please?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Mike Posen from Earl Estates. How realistic were the Treasury estimates of cutbacks in central government spending over the next few years? And are we seeing the sharp reduction in money to local authorities now as being the easy cut which central government can make?
I think those questions really go beyond my brief. One of my slides said the OBR does not, and I'm not, I mean, I can say what I like now, I'm not on the OBR, but the OBR's role was not to comment on the constitution of policy, the split between spending, the particular spending measures. And I wouldn't want to comment on how realistic Labour's spending measures were, but cuts in public spending have to be realistic to deliver our budgetary ambitions. So whether local authorities are easy meat, I don't know, but we do have to. I mean, I could have put a chart up of public spending relative to GDP and taxes relative to GDP. And if you look at the history, it's public spending that is way out of line. And that's partly because, of course, GDP fell and public spending didn't. But if you were objectively looking at the spending and tax to GDP ratios, you would say spending is out of line. So it's spending, A, that the research tells us, and B, observation tells us, is where the brunt of the cut should fall.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, yes, this gentleman here.
I suppose the observation must be, do you have an opinion about the big society and the transfer of public expenditure to voluntary expenditure, and whether that will work, which seems to be what it's about?
Well, I don't have a view on the big society, other than that my son has a DPhil from Oxford and can't get a job, so we should put a lot more money into universities, is my view. No, I don't have a view on big society issues.
Okay, I mean,
some of our panellists might, but...
We'll come back to that in a minute. One more question then before we move on. This gentleman here.
Amal Pandya, Arden Partners. I was wondering, do you think the OBR places enough emphasis on the negative impacts of tax increases in its forecast, such as the bank levy or the bonus regulations, the VAT increases, and how that's going to have a negative impact on growth? It sounds like it doesn't, and over the next 5 years, sort of revenues will fall from what a lot of people think. Does the OBR do that?
We were heavily time constrained, obviously, particularly not so much the budget, which was a set of standard tax type measures, for which we were able to draw on research for fiscal multipliers. But when it came to the spending review, which was in October the 29th, or sometime in October anyway, the effects of the spending cuts on the supply side of the economy, both negative from infrastructure or positive, possibly, from sharpening incentives. Today's the Universal Credit Day, but that's meant to sharpen incentives on the supply of labour. But in the time that I was there that we had available, it was very difficult to make guesstimates on any of those supply side things, as was a demand side approach. And that's always going to be the case. Precisely how the bank levy and other measures changes the behaviour of the banks is, not easy to answer. Whether they're trying to take that process further now, I don't know. I'm not involved, but it's an obvious area for them to do research on, yes.
Okay, I think on that need for further research, we'll go for some further comment as well. And maybe we'll come back to these difficult supply side questions as we listen to the comments of our other speakers. So I'd like to start now by introducing the panel, each of whom is going to give us a short response to these questions. A huge amount of experience around me in thinking about and commenting on the UK economy in general, and indeed policy and fiscal policy in particular. Starting on my left, Chris Giles is now economics editor at the Financial Times, but he did work for the Institute for Fiscal Studies once upon a time, so that leading light in independent thought on fiscal matters. Then to my immediate right is Philip Booth from the Institute for Economic Affairs, and he too, not as an economist to start, but as an actuary, isn't it? You're an actuary by training.
That's sort of diversion from
that was a diversion from economics. Economics was too exciting, that's what they say. Or accountancy was too exciting, even. So he's been editorial and programme director at the IEA, and indeed is also professor of insurance and risk management at the Cass Business School. Risk management is clearly something that we all need more of. And then furthest to my right is Graeme Leach, who only had to come down a few stairs because he is the chief economist and director of policy at the Institute of Directors. So I was particularly impressed he got here quite early. Normally it's the person who has least far to go who is the latest.
You're sitting in my office. I've had to move on.
And which he joined in 98. He's got a private sector background also as an economist with the Henley Centre and with PIDA. So a big range of experience here. 5 minutes each, guys, starting with you.
Thank you very much.
And I'll put my stop clock on.
The essay question is the long-term structural reform of the public sector, and this is a huge topic, and I think much of it, as some of the questions said, is microeconomics based if you're actually thinking about the long-term reform of the public sector. But I'm going to avoid micro issues, only to say two things. One is that micro reforms of the public sector, there are very few no-brainers out there. There's very few sort of really, really low-hanging fruit, simple wins. All of these things involve trade-offs, and they all involve winners and losers. Politics often trump economics in these sorts of decisions. So that's just one very quick thought. But on the questions that we've been asked to address, did the spending review go far enough? I'm going to address this in two ways. One, thinking about the public finances. And I think there's a growing chance that the answer to that question might be no. That we might have to do more public spending cuts and more tax rises than we thought. And it comes down to the view that maybe the supply capacity of the UK economy is even worse than the more cautious estimates put forward by the Office for Budget Responsibility. This is what the latest IFS Green Budget suggested. It's what the Bank of England in its inflation report yesterday said. They gave quite a few reasons why the ability of the UK economy to supply goods and services was actually not as strong as it was, and it's exactly what Andrew Sentence was saying today. Now, I'm very much with Andrew Sentence on the fact that I really, really hate output gap estimates, and I know that to get precise numbers, you have to do it, but I'm not going to mention any cyclically adjusted numbers because I don't think they're worth the paper they're written on. We've got a budget deficit of 10%. We're seeking to get that down to 1% by 2015-16. This is the government's plan. This is not cyclically adjusted. This is just... And there's a chance that we won't meet that because growth will not be as fast as we had hoped it would be and the OBR hoped it would be. I think that's a difficult thing that we might have to address in the next few years. On the public spending side, are we going far enough? I think probably the answer is yes. I think the research on whether spending cuts or tax increases are better for fiscal consolidations is very, very tenuous. The National Institute of Economic and Social Research has just recently come out with a counter view saying tax increases are better than spending cuts. Personally, I think it really depends on what the spending cuts are and what the tax increases are. There's good and bad on both sides, but it's clear that we're having the biggest and sustained programme of public spending cuts since the Second World War, and this will be tough, and there's no getting around that. Does the spending review go fast enough? I think this really depends on the question that Geoff put up about multipliers. If the overall fiscal multiplier is 0.6, so that you don't, for every bit you try and reduce the deficit, you lose less of that in GDP, then this speed seems okay. But it is important to say that the OBR's assumption of the long-term multiplier, which Geoff didn't put up, is 0. So it says it has no effect on the overall trend rate of growth, and that's a very strong assumption. And it's not an assumption that the OBR or government like to sort of admit that they have in their forecasts, and it's quite possible, if things go wrong, if the short-term multiplier is higher, that the long-term multiplier might also be higher, and that will make things, again, even harder than we think. Geoff's absolutely right, there is no alternative. We have to get rid of this deficit, and it's only if you have extremely high multipliers where you can say, actually, growth is going to be the solution. But I think there is quite a strong case for saying that this current government is maybe going too fast. I can't prove it, but I believe the credibility problem that the last government had and the public finances had wasn't because of the speed of their deficit reduction, it's because, quite frankly, Labour's heart wasn't in the deficit reduction programme they actually had. They were not willing to say before the election what they were going to cut, and it was quite clear that had they actually won the election and had to implement what their budget plans had said, they would have found that extremely difficult. I was asked to say what I think will be in the next budget. Well, I don't think there'll be big changes. I don't think the OBR is going to do what I say and have a very long look at the output gap and change that, because I think it's too soon. I think that's maybe something we'll see in the next few years. So I don't think the fiscal numbers will look terribly different. The budget's all going to be about growth. It's going to be a budget for growth, and not in a sort of Labour-style initiative-itis sense. I'm sure the new government is going to try and say what they're doing is creating the conditions for private sector growth. But of course, we have to remember there's huge problems in all of the areas that we know are difficult for supply capacity and supply of the economy. I'll be finished very soon. Land use, planning, there's a huge tussle within government. Immigration, and maybe foreign students coming in might help the economy again. There's the government policy is going against that. Infrastructure, that's where we're seeing the biggest public spending cuts you can go on. Will the next budget have an effect on interest rates? No, I'm sure that's one thing I'm absolutely positive about, because if the Bank of England ignored the June budget, which had a very big fiscal change, then it's going to certainly ignore whatever happens in March. And what steps should be taken to ensure deficit reduction is sustainable? I think we just have to be aware that things will not turn out as the nice numbers of forecasts, whether the Bank of England forecasts or the OBR's forecasts say they will. That will be extremely unlikely. So we must make sure we are very clear about the goal to get rid of the budget deficit over a reasonable time frame, and then review and revise the plans as the facts change.
Okay. Thank you very much. Moving straight on, over to you, Philip, for your comments on these questions.
Thanks. I'll use a lectern, then I can see the stoplight and you can feel in full control. So, well, the government's embarked...
in full control. It won't be in full control, but hey.
The government has embarked on a process of reducing spending from around 50% of GDP, depending on how you measure it, to about 40% of GDP by 2015. In other words, spending will fall as a proportion of national income only to 2004 levels, and in real terms to round about 2008 levels. And this may seem like a rather modest aim, but there will still be a lot of pain from that for two reasons. Firstly, because spending in 2015 will include a larger element for debt interest, which will rise by about £20 billion in the next 4 years. And secondly, reducing the size of the public sector is never an easy business. And for reasons explained by the economist William Niskanen, when public spending is cut, it's always the muscle of frontline public services that is cut first. And that is because the fat of the bureaucracy is actually taking the decisions with regard to what to cut. So the Chief Executive's department will cut all the libraries, and the Chief Executive and his department will remain in place until there are no other services actually provided by the local authority. I don't expect spending cuts to have an adverse impact on economic growth, not least because in an economy with a floating exchange rate, if you have higher government borrowing, it tends to raise the real exchange rate, and therefore the effects of fiscal consolidation are much more benign in countries with floating exchange rates. So in my view, the government shouldn't have a plan B. But from there, I part company. It seems that the government wishes to reduce spending, and this is quite clear if you look at Osborne's statements, to 40% of national income and stop there. And I don't believe that that is sufficient. I think government spending needs to be reduced to much lower levels, partly to give scope for tax reductions and radical tax reform, but also because demographic pressures in the very long term will become very important, and we need to develop more pre-funding and private saving for pensions, healthcare, and so on. However, in the short term, the key focus of the government, I think, should be on radical supply-side liberalisation. Now, this, in theory, is not the direct concern of the budget, but ever since Gordon Brown, more or less everything has become the concern of the Treasury, and so I think this will be an issue which is broached to some extent in March. Our government spends over 25% of national income on social transfer benefits, yet we have very high rates of inequality and combined with very high rates of labour market inactivity. 17% of UK households have nobody in work, and I think this is a symptom to a large degree of the penalties that tax and welfare benefits impose on work and also family formation. And the government plans in this area will not actually change things all that radically. They will still leave us in a situation where the less well-off lose 75% of any additional money that they earn. The government's moves with regard to labour market regulation in the last 12 months have all been retrograde, and there's much more to come. The British Chambers of Commerce estimate that before the coalition government leaves office, the regulatory measures to be introduced in 2011 alone will cost employers £23 billion. So we do need, I think, radical labour market deregulation as part of a liberalisation agenda. So, in summary, the economy has suffered a huge misallocation of resources in recent years as a result of the boom that resulted in the financial crash and the simultaneous movement of resources into the government sector. And it's essential that there are as few impediments as possible to the re-employment of those resources. So the government doesn't need a plan B, it needs a complementary plan to ensure that as government spending is reduced, the private sector is able to expand. So my hopes for the budget are as follows. A pledge to continue reducing public spending as a share of national income after 2015, a radical review of the welfare and tax systems, major reviews of labour market regulation and planning. To suggest a review sounds rather weak, but it's really the most a budget can do specifically. And a review of local government finance. It's an issue I've not mentioned, but I think we need to give serious consideration to radical fiscal decentralisation in the UK. My very firm prediction is that none of these will form part of the budget. We'll get some tinkering around the edges in some of these areas. Thanks.
Well, I have to say, in one respect, Philip is an excellent forecaster. That's 5 minutes and 1 second.
Oh, well.
Well, 0.1 of a second, actually, so that's pretty good. Graeme, that leaves you a target to hit.
Leaves me under pressure.
Over to you.
Thank you, Bridget. We've only got a few minutes, so I'd like to really make some generalised comments on focusing particularly on the spending squeeze. And really sort of challenging the received wisdom, certainly the media wisdom, as to the significance of the impact of the spending squeeze. I'm going to say that maybe there is a more optimistic interpretation than has been made at the present time. I think the first thing to say, though, is I think we're in the phony war period. We're in the period between September 1939 and spring 1940, when the full impact of the conflict or the full impact of the spending is yet to come through. Now, there's no sign whatsoever of Mr. Osborne going wobbly, so the charge sort of "don't go wobbly, George" isn't quite there yet. But we are already seeing this increase in really media focus on exactly where the cuts are going to hit. And I think what Philip's comments there about bureaucracy survives, frontline services don't. I think it's slightly worrying at the present time that we really are in the phony war, because the shouting won't start until the next financial year. So you ain't seen nothing yet, to coin a phrase, I think, there. But maybe I think more useful is just to focus on some of the data here and to say, look, everybody's talking about this once-in-a-generation spending squeeze. Well, actually, it's just rubbish. We've actually been here before, and we've been here more recently than many people think. And the key factor there is if you look back into the 1990s alone, then during the peak-to-trough fall in public spending as a proportion of GDP in the 1990s was around 7.4% of GDP. The peak-to-trough fall now, by 2015-16, admittedly beyond the end of the spending squeeze period, is 7.9%. So it's broadly comparable with the peak-to-trough fall in the 90s. Were the 1990s the worst period of economic performance in the last 20 years or in a generation? No, of course they weren't. And if you take a slightly shorter time horizon, if you take the first 2 years of the coalition, so admittedly we're in the current financial year, which is outside the spending squeeze, but it's all about the time when we're going to see recession or recovery or whatever. And so if you look at the first 2 years of the coalition government and you compare it with the first 2 years of the Brown chancellorship, when, if you remember, he had promised to implement Ken Clarke's spending plans, even though Ken Clarke probably dreaded waking up, winning the election and having to implement his own spending plans. But so be it. 2.7% cut there versus 2.2% of GDP now in the first 2 years of the coalition. Were the first 2-3 years of the Labour government the end of the world? No, they weren't. It was one of the fastest periods of economic growth in the last 20 years. So, yes, the economic backdrop is different now in the wake of the financial crisis. The international backdrop is different. But that still surely says that some of the more nightmarish scenarios that are put forward at present are overplayed. You can contract the state without it being the end of the world for the rest of the economy. I am not arguing that we will achieve the rates of economic growth we achieved in the late 1990s. I don't believe we will. But I think actually economic performance will be better in the medium term than many people think. But if one looks at the fiscal angle alone, now, there are other factors which are out there as well, which will contract, which I think actually in terms of monetary policy in the banking system and the legacy of the financial crisis, which will still outweigh there. And if you look at money supply growth, for example, at the present time, I think that would support that sort of argument. So I'm not saying we're suddenly going to be okay on the growth front, we're not. But what I am saying is if you focus on one element of that, if you focus on fiscal policy, it's not so bad. And in nominal terms, by 2015-16, spending is still up by 90 billion. If you look at the real terms cut in expenditure, yes, it does fall, but it's only around 0.5% per annum in overall terms, although clearly there's an increased debt interest share there. But if you look at that 0.5% per annum fall in real spending on public spending, if you think of the major cost in the public sector, which is wage growth, actually I think that the public sector deflator may be overstated, and consequently we may end up with sort of no change in public spending in terms of negative real terms change. So the numbers, if you look at the departmental level, yes, are big. Those 20% cuts, they are big because we're ring-fencing certain areas. But I think actually the negative impact of the spending squeeze is overstated. I think we would actually, the IOD would argue actually that you needed deeper cuts elsewhere, because actually you should ring-fence public sector infrastructure spending, transport, energy infrastructure, ICT infrastructure. You could ring-fence that. But beyond that criticism, I think we would support the government policy. As Philip said, spending is still 40% of GDP by the end of the forecast period. And actually, public sector employment is projected by the OBR now, with the latest projections, to fall by less than it did in the 1990s. It fell by about 600,000 in total. Take out reclassifications changes, and it's probably just under 500,000. So there's a wider context and a wider picture here, which I think cautions against overly negative interpretations. We could get into a whole debate about expansionary fiscal contractions. I'm not necessarily subscribing to that view. All I am saying is that the positive fiscal multiplier effect may be smaller at the very least. And just finally, just to finish, I think the key thing here is that we don't want to waste a good crisis. If you are going to take this once-in-a-generation, if you call it a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reduce public spending, then do it properly. And I think we're seeing real radicalism here. We're seeing, the ending potentially of a national health service, the ending of a national education system with free schools. So there is radicalism in there. My only concern is, though, that all this radicalism is further down the line in terms of the impact it will have, and we're making good old knee-jerk slice and dice spending cuts at the moment, which may not be the right sort of structural change we want to achieve. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You weren't quite as on the button as Philip, but I'll forgive you for that, I suppose. I might see you later. Okay, we've got a variety of different sort of views here. Some optimism, quite considerable optimism, about the positive benefits of spending cuts in refocusing public services and allowing us to do these things differently. Or indeed the sheer just reducing the scale of public spending as a way of liberating the economy. Perhaps Chris being slightly more cautious about whether this is actually too far and too fast. And I suppose there the proposition is that Keynesianism, to at least to a certain extent, should prevail. And when the private sector isn't producing, then that is the point where the public sector needs to step in and produce the jobs, so that the welfare benefit reform couldn't possibly kick in to do that. So there are contentions here between different views of the way that the economy works. Perhaps I might therefore start by asking you, what's the single thing that you would like to see happen in the next budget? And I'll involve Geoff in this as well. Start at the other end. Oh, well. Graeme, what's the single thing that you would most like to see?
Well, we're sitting in the IOD, so I suppose I would say a real commitment for maybe not an explicit change immediately, but a genuine commitment by the Chancellor to say the 50p rate is a temporary rate.
Okay.
Okay, I'm not sure whether this is an imaginary world of a Philip Booth budget or in terms of what might reasonably be expected, but I suppose in the latter category, much further reform of welfare benefits so that work really does pay.
Making work pay. Okay. Chris?
I think a commitment from the new government to radically reform land use and planning.
Okay.
Chris asked me this question in his January survey, and I refused to answer it then. But I will tell you my biggest gripe, and I'm going to shoot myself in the foot here. The Prime Minister says we're all in this together, but wealthy pensioners aren't in it at all. And there's a lot of them. My pension goes up in April, I believe, by the January RPI, or 5%, whichever is the smaller, so I'm being diddled out of 0.1. I get my free bus pass, I get my free winter fuel allowance, which I always jokingly said I used to heat my swimming pool. There's a lot of poor pensioners, of course, but the idea that pensioners can have a triple lock and always get the lowest or the most, whatever it is this triple lock exactly says, I think is misplaced, but I do know pensioners vote Conservative.
Fine. Okay, well, doing something about pensions slightly, I think I'll add my own 2 pence to this, which is that what I would like to see is a real focus on decentralisation of finances, which is another way of saying that you'd unlock some of the Treasury control over finances. I think that might be a fantasy budget as well, actually, in spite of the way that it's all talked about. So there you've got some individual ideas. Open it up to you now, either to say what you would particularly like to see in this budget or to comment on the positions being taken by the speakers here. Any suggestions for what you would like to see being announced in the next budget?
Sorry, Deborah Hyde, Citywire. This isn't a suggestion, it was a follow-up to Philip Booth. The IFS have said that we do need a plan B, if only so that people know when the government will change its mind, to give some kind of certainty. Philip Booth says we don't need a plan B. What does everybody else think?
Okay, should there be a plan B? Who'd like to come in on that? Graeme?
I think the criticism of the government's a bit unfair here, because I think there is a plan B. If you look at Lambert's comments a couple of weeks ago, he was all about the media portrayal. This was all about, demand was being killed by the spending cuts, and so you needed a plan B on the demand side. But actually, if you read the text of the speech, it's saying completely the opposite. What Richard Lambert was actually saying was that you needed to focus on the supply side of the economy and liberalisation there. And I would agree with Chris that things like radical planning reform, but I would also argue more in terms of tax reductions, spending reductions elsewhere, infrastructure investment as well. That supply side element is what we need. So we don't need a plan B, we need a parallel policy for the supply side, which is radical and deep.
Okay. Other versions? Anybody else got a suggestion for a plan B?
Well, I think there's a confusion here, because when people say plan B, they have different things in their minds. So if you have taken Ed Ballsian plan B, which is rip up plan A straight away and slow down the spending cuts, no, I don't think that is a plan B. But what I would say is a contingency plan, which might well be public, saying if things go off track, this is what we do. I don't think that shows any weakness. I think it shows maturity and transparency.
Do you think we should have such a plan then?
Yes, I think you should have a contingency plan. You shouldn't change what you're doing now. That's the government's plan. But you should recognise that things could go wrong, or things could go a hell of a lot better than you think. And in either of those cases, you should have you should actually say what you were going to do in those circumstances.
Oh, and would you use for a trigger? Because presumably to do that and have a public announcement, you'd have to have some kind of trigger for what represented going much worse or much better. Would you want to use a growth number for that, or a public finance number for that?
Well, I would use a straight public finance number. The current government couldn't do that because it would be ripping up their fiscal mandate. So they would have to use some form of structural current budget announcement if they were going to do it.
The problem is with the plan B is where does it lead you? If the trigger for doing something different is that the structural budget deficit is higher, then there's something different, presumably ought to be to cut spending further in order to reduce the budget deficits further, rather than to say, we'll allow it to increase even further. If everything's going fine and the budget deficit is actually falling more rapidly than anticipated, then no, terrific, just allow it to continue to fall more rapidly, and one will achieve the long-term objectives of lower taxes and so on even better. I think, and as Chris said, it depends what you mean by plan B. If despite all the efforts the government doesn't manage to cut public spending, they'll need better plans to cut public spending. But I think that's a slightly different sort of plan B than Ed Balls has in mind, certainly.
Do people think, though, that there's a kind of, this is certainly important in monetary policy, that the announcement effect that you might have of saying, well, we think the next rises in interest rates are going to be up, people start including those into their forecasts. If you announce you're going to have a plan B and this is the trigger for it, does that actually affect people's expectations and then their behaviour? Is there a feedback mechanism potentially here?
I think there is, and also rhetorically, it's just difficult to get clarity in the argument as well. I mean, we've seen that with the forests climb down. So it started off with the forest privatisation, and then lots of bells and whistles that were going to be attached to it, and it became impossible for the government to coherently sell its policy, and now it's climbed down. That's a relatively minor area of policy, but I think when it starts saying, yes, the plan is this, but if that happens, then we'll do this instead, and so on, I think it becomes difficult rhetorically to make the argument.
Could I just come in?
Yes.
I mean, just one slightly different comment, but related. I think we're talking here about potential for a mistake in fiscal policy, but I actually think the bigger mistake at the present time is for a mistake in monetary policy. I mean, we're talking about raising interest rates at a time when money supply growth is negative. So you just look at the state of the money supply, and everybody's talking about raising interest rates. There's actually a bigger risk of a mistake there, I think, than on fiscal policy.
Okay, so we need a plan B for Monetary Policy Committee. I'm not sure that's quite on our agenda at the moment.
Sorry.
But never mind. Who else would like to come in here on the need for new kinds of fiscal policy, or indeed whether they think the way that it's going is right? Let me ask you for a show of hands then. Let me ask you, who thinks that the balance is in the right direction? Sorry, the balance of the current government's plans for tax rises and spending plans that they have in that they had in the last budget. Is that the right? Yeah. Okay. Who thinks that we should be going more slowly and should be having fewer spending cuts? Okay. And who thinks we should be going more quickly? Okay, well, actually, on balance, you all think that there's a slight balance towards going more quickly and doing this more strongly.
It is the IOD with an IEA agenda.
Nonetheless, it might be...
This wasn't planned.
Exactly.
It's like asking people outside of
Can we take that into the alternative vote system?
And certainly not. Yes, you wanted to come in, did you? Yes? Can we have a microphone, please?
Hi, sorry, Amal Pandya again. Are tax cuts, I'm keep going on about tax cuts, I'm sorry, but I've just got my first job, so a bit keen on them. Are they a prerequisite to economic growth, or are they a reward? And secondly, if I can ask, if the panel is willing to reveal this, in an ideal world, assuming there's no World War III or a massive ecological disaster, where would they like to see government spending as a proportion of GDP?
Yeah, go on.
I think, well, the latter question first. I think in the long term, I think you can show that the improvement in social outcomes is not materially that significant with a public spending to GDP ratio much above 30%. So I think we could go a lot deeper and a lot further there. Practically and politically, whether we'll get there, well, not in my great-grandchildren's lifetime, I don't think, no. So we've got a while there to go. In terms of tax cuts, I think one of the arguments for going further and deeper on the spending side would be actually to take that ratio up further, that 80-20 ratio up to 90%. We've got damaging tax effects coming in for the next financial year. And it's not only hitting short-term demand, but my problem here is the more adjustment you put on the tax front in terms of higher taxes, the more you're undermining the long-term supply-side performance of the economy as well. So I think ideally one would like to go higher, but politically it's never going to happen, so it's really not worth debating, really.
Well, in June or July, the IEA will be publishing a book which will be described called something like First Steps to a Smaller State, and we'll be suggesting that the ratio of public spending to national income should go down to about 30%. So that's the first step. So I think it should reduce significantly, and the scope then for private initiative in areas such as health, education, welfare and so on, as well as the improvements to the supply side economy, would, I think, ensure that we're all better off as a result. Regarding the first part of the question, that's interesting. I think actually there are so many areas where there is scope for liberalisation of the UK economy. Planning has been mentioned several times, but doesn't seem to be very much on the political agenda. Employment regulation, welfare and so on, that tax cuts I don't think are a prerequisite for economic growth, but they can be, but economic growth will be higher, all other things being equal, if we have tax cuts.
Chris?
I would say taxes clearly distort economic behaviour. So lower taxes, you would think the economy would work better than with higher taxes. But in the big main taxes we've got, the distortions are small. And so we shouldn't expect tax cuts to be a panacea that suddenly transforms the UK economy. As far as spending as a share of GDP is concerned, I'm desperately agnostic on this issue. I think you have societies that work very well, are competitive and dynamic with spending at 60% of GDP. You look at the Nordic countries, and you have societies which are competitive and dynamic at 20 and 30% of GDP. And you have sclerotic societies with very low taxes like Japan. So I think what I'd like to see is a level of spending as a share of GDP is a level that Britain is comfortable with.
I was going to use the word comfortable, exactly. I'm agnostic. As long as the current generation of taxpayers is comfortable paying for the current level of expenditure within the sort of parameters that we've been operating in for a long time, that would suit me fine.
Good, doesn't it?
Well,
Did you want to come back?
I just wanted to come back on the Nordic countries, because when spending was up there at 60% of national income, economic growth moved rapidly down towards zero. And the high level of growth in, well, certainly Sweden, I don't know much about the other Nordic countries, I must say, in Sweden took place before public spending rose rapidly in the 1970s, and then after it was cut from the mid-1980s onwards. And the Swedish economy was almost bankrupted by its levels of public spending of around 60% of national income. As it happens at the moment, UK public spending is not very different from public spending in Sweden.
I mean, I would just support that. I think if you look in detail at the Nordic model, it makes the case for a smaller state. It doesn't make the case for a larger state. It makes the case for a smaller state when you look at it in detail and what's driving the supply side.
I can remember in the 1960s when people would say of Japan, it has a small public sector and it grows very rapidly. And now, as Chris has just said, Japan has a small public sector and it grows very slowly. So different economies at different times can do different things, but I don't think there's a hard and fast rule.
Well, I think we would all agree that it's not just about the size of the public sector as measured as a percentage of GNP.
I think you can easily exaggerate the importance of spending as a share of GDP. If you think of what governments do, governments redistribute, governments regulate, and governments buy stuff. And it's only really in the redistribution and the buying stuff which is measured in spending as a share of GDP. So you can have very effective governments with high spending as a share of GDP, and you can have very ineffective governments with low spending as a share of GDP. And I think as a nation we are completely obsessed by this one number, which often is quite meaningless.
So what you're really saying is that, in part, it depends what else is going on in the private sector.
Yeah. You've got to think
so if you have a big GDP because you have a very successful private sector, then in fact you can run the same level of services and it's a smaller proportion of GDP. So that's part of so for example, there are more public sector employees in London than anywhere else in the country, but it's a smaller proportion of output in London because there's an awful lot of other stuff that goes on. Whereas if you go to other places, it's a very high proportion because there's very little else. But the same things are being done in the same way and actually, in fact, costing relatively more compared to the cost of living in those places. So perhaps you're right that we should, as ever, one should get away from the simple headline numbers, but we probably won't. We probably ought to draw it to a close at this point, unless, is anybody else who'd like to ask a question or make a comment at the moment? Okay, in that case, I would like to thank very much the assembled expertise and range of views that we've got on the panel this afternoon, as it now is, and ask you to thank them in the usual way. And I'd also like to, before we break for lunch, I'd like you to remind you that there are evaluation forms which we would like you to fill in and give your feedback on this. There will be a photograph of the students, so please could you remain at the back before you go for lunch. I know that's an imposition, but there you go. But before any of that, I'd like to invite Mark Littlewood to come up as Director General of the IEA to introduce the National Free Enterprise Award.
No, here it is. Bridget, thanks very much. The National Free Enterprise Award is given each year to the person judged to have made the greatest contribution to the market economy, whether as a journalist, a politician, an academic or intellectual of some other sort. It was established in 1975, was originally awarded by an organisation called Aims of Industry. Its first winner was Sir Keith Joseph. Other winners over the years include Margaret Thatcher, Frederick Hayek, Richard Branson and Nigel Lawson. Last year's winners were Eamon Butler and Madsen Peary of the Adam Smith Institute. I mentioned at the outset that the IEA's mission, educational mission, is to improve public understanding of the role of free markets. And to that extent, we run lots of events, not many of them quite as large as this one, but we also seek to communicate our ideas through the media. I've just noticed, for example, that Andrew Sentence's remarks from this morning are one of the top stories running on the business section of the BBC website as we speak. In recognition of the important role that the media can play in communicating ideas, the winner of the National Free Enterprise Award for 2010 is television producer and presenter Martin Durkin. Martin is the managing director of WAG TV, one of the world-leading producers of documentaries. He has produced and directed a whole series of documentaries around arts, science, history, and various social documentaries as well. But this award marks a documentary that was broadcast in November of last year, entitled Britain's £1 Trillion Horror Story. It was broadcast on Channel 4, attracted well over 1 million viewers on the night, has been watched substantially on the Channel 4 Play It Again section of their website and is still available there now, and will be shortly available on DVD. And I believe we have a short clip from the documentary to show you now.
In communist China, the state controls around 28% of the economy. In Britain, the state controls 53% of the economy.
The public sector spends more than the private sector in Britain, doesn't it?
Well, the public sector is an important part of our economy, of course, yes.
The public sector is bigger than the private sector now, isn't it?
Well, I mean, the two are mutually... The two parts of the economy depend on each other, don't they?
Well, I mean, the public sector certainly depends on the private sector. I mean, it's debatable how much the private sector depends on the public sector.
The last government tested to destruction the idea that more spending was the answer.
But you're taking money out of the productive economy, and then you say you spend a little money of that money back in the productive economy. How is that stimulating?
Politicians keep talking about what they're going to spend, as though it's their money. They haven't got any of their own money. They've got our money.
You have to remember that when the government creates a job by taxing more, it's destroying jobs elsewhere by the act of taxation.
The government is spending over 50% of national income this year. You can't tax 50% of total national income just by taxing rich people. There aren't enough of them and they don't earn enough money.
It is estimated that the state now accounts for more than 60% of the economy in Scotland. In the North East, it's 73%. In Wales, it's 77%. And in Northern Ireland, the state accounts for a staggering 81% of the economy.
When you've got to 70% of GDP public sector, that's worse even than what you had in a lot of Eastern European countries in the 1980s, when these countries were officially communist.
One of the problems with government when it gets very large is that there's a vast number of interest groups who are feeding from the public trough.
When are we actually going to realise that a growing state sector doesn't work? 55%? 60%? 65%? How much of the economy have our political classes got to control until we say enough?
The idea that we need state monopolies in order to look after the poor is obviously untrue.
We make sure poor people in Britain have shoes and clothes and food, but we don't have state shoe shops and state clothes shops and government canteens. Can you imagine how awful that would be?
People say you can't possibly privatise health and education because private firms will be in it to make a profit. But we're surrounded by wonderful things made by companies who need to make a profit. Do we say, we can't have a washing machine made by Bosch or Sanusi because they make a profit? Much better to have a washing machine made by the state. Let's not get a Toyota, they're in it for the money. Much wiser to wait in a queue for a government-made Trabant.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the winner of the 2010 National Free Enterprise Award, Martin Durkin.
Just a couple of words, because I know it's lunchtime. First of all, Barcelona, and then this. This is proving to be a very good week. I'm deeply conscious that at the beginning of this process, I got on the blower to the IEA and proceeded to have very wet lunches with Philip Booth and Richard Wellings, and then even wetter evenings with Mark Littlewood and Ruth Porter and Philip and the rest of them. And throughout the process, obviously benefited from all those lovely little IEA booklets and talking to all the IEA authors, and in the end, interviewing lots of the IEA authors and 3 of the people who are working for the IRA. So in a deep IRA, I did it again. That was the second time. The provisional IEA. So in a deep and true sense, the IEA has awarded this to itself, but I'm no less grateful for receiving it. I think when it gets to the position that the government is spending more than all private individuals and companies put together, it's a very worrying state of affairs. I mean, we've called the conference the state of the economy, but really it should be the state of Britain. And the difficulty is when you say, we've got used to this gigantic state, rather like ancient Egyptian slaves get used to building pyramids. It's just kind of there and we're used to it. And challenging it is very difficult because you have legions of Keynesian economists publicly funded who will defend it, and of course the Leviathan BBC state broadcaster who will defend it. And so who will stick up for freedom and progress and reason, just as we used to enjoy it in the good old days? Well, we have the IEA, thank goodness. And you may say they've got a tough task ahead of them, but I would just remind you, Arsenal 2, Barcelona 1.
This is your first one to see.
Oh, right, very good. I'll go with you.